I welcome all of you to this second day of the conclave being organized by Krishnamurti Foundation India Cuttack Center. This is the second day of the conclave, of this theme conclave, exploring conditioning. So yesterday we had a very good session. We heard Mark Lee had an interactive session followed by the group discussion. Yesterday we had some issues with this breakout room because of some unavoidable circumstances. We had to face certain issues with that. But today we are trying to fix it. So today we are going to create 7 rooms for the breakout room discussion. And we will have this facilitator, one facilitator and one co-facilitator in each of the rooms. So today, the second day, as all of you know, today we have, first we will listen to the video, followed by 2 minutes silence. After that, we will hear Professor Krishna. Then it will be followed like yesterday, it will be followed by an interactive session. If you want, you can ask question. You can ask, or if you want to ask, then you have to raise your hand, or else you can put it in the chat box. We will read it out, whichever is convenient for you. And then it will be followed by a 15 minutes break. And finally, we will end with the breakout room discussion. Again, I welcome all of you. And as you know, this session is recorded. We have started the recording. And one more thing for those, say the videos, audio quality, those who are finding it difficult to hear, really, we are sorry for that. And but we will share the transcript of the video. We have the transcript of the video. So soon after this today's session, we are going to share the transcript of these videos. So now let us watch the video. Nandini.
So, would you like to go into the basic question of conditioning, its effect on our thinking, and what we can do about it?
I wonder what we mean by conditioning. Is it the tradition, not only present-day tradition, but centuries and centuries of tradition that had been handed down from generation to generation? And is it, this conditioning, the whole background of civilization, culture, the social impacts, and the many, many experiences that one has? Do all this contribute to the conditioning of the brain? Not only all this, but also the various impressions, the propaganda, the literature, the television. All this seems to add to the background, to the conditioning of every human being, whether he's very, very, very poor, uneducated, utterly most primitive, and to the most highly educated, sophisticated human beings. This conditioning seems to be inevitable. It has been a factor that has endured probably over 1 million years or 50,000 years. If all that is the conditioning or the background of every human being, and that obviously shapes our thinking, controls our reactions and responses, and our way of behavior, conduct, and the way we eat and think and feel and react and all that. That seems to be the normal conditioning of human beings. And that has shaped our society in which we live. The society is what we are made of it, what each individual throughout the 1,000,000 or 50,000 years have, according to their desires, ambitions, conditioning, to their personal tendencies, to their aggression and so on. All this has actually contributed to the society in which we live. So the society is not different from us. That's a fact we seem to forget when we talk about society. Society is something that gradually has come into being to which we have given all our endeavor, all our struggles, all our imprints and tendencies. This is the society, and the society is us. It is not two separate entities. I think this must be clearly understood. The socialists, perhaps some of the capitalists, and certainly the communists, try to change the social structure by laws, by various edicts and so on. It appears that they forget the human quality, the human conditioning, and try to shape the outward structure without taking into deep consideration the human character, the human behavior, the human structure, the condition of his brain, which has been programmed for thousands of years. And it seems to us the conditioning of the human being is to be examined much more thoroughly, gone into it very, very deeply, and find out whether the human condition can ever be radically changed. And so the social structure, which is born of human condition, can also be changed. That's the real problem. Not only the freedom of human beings, who have been programmed. We are using the word programmed in the sense that computer is being programmed by experts, by specialists, and so on. So we human beings, whether we live in the most primitive, brutal state, or the highly educated scientific community, we seem to neglect or even forget that this psychological structure, the subjective entity who has brought about this really rather insane world, whether that human condition can ever be radically changed. That is the chief concern in your question, surely. So we must go into that. Not only superficially, the outward signs of it, but also the human brain, which has evolved through thousands upon thousands of years. That brain itself, through tradition, through religious propaganda, through the propaganda of politicians and the leaders of religious hierarchy, the philosophers of India and Asia, all that have to be taken into account, which is basically means the brain of human beings have been shaped by experience, by knowledge, by propaganda, and so on. If we are clear on that, then we must inevitably ask, naturally, whether the brain can ever be cleansed, if I can use that word, of all the process of time.
So, am I correct in understanding that this conditioning of which you speak goes into the human consciousness in some before the birth of the human being? In other words, he is born with a certain loading of conditioning, a certain content in his very brain that you would call conditioning. It's not only what happens to him in his actual life as he grows up.
Not only that, but we use the word consciousness. Which is, if we can examine that for a while, that consciousness is all our reactions, responses, all our idiosyncrasies and tendencies, both biological as well as psychological, and all the beliefs, faith, the gods man has invented, the rituals, the daily routine of work with its boredom, with its mechanical responses, and also the fears, the anxieties, the pain, the depression, the elation, the intense sorrow, the loneliness, the uncertainty of the future. All that and the fear of death and the continuity and all that is our consciousness. That consciousness, with its content, is the conditioning. And that conditioning is centuries old. So the brain itself is the center of all this.
Thank you, Nandini, for sharing the video. Now, I would like to request Nandini to introduce Professor Krishna.
Thank you, Soumitra. Hello, good morning to all of you, and also good evening. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Professor Krishna, who is going to address today's theme for the session. Actually, last night, when I was trying to organize my thoughts as to decide what I'm going to talk about Professor Krishna, I came to realize that I have been thinking through a thick cloud of conditioning. Images have been pouring into my head: how he looks, how he speaks, what he has written, what is his philosophy. Then I thought to myself, what is the point of describing a person who is full of life, alive, and a source of tremendous energy through my interpretation, my memory, my belief, my ideas about this person? No person who is alive and full of energy and life can ever be described and defined through opinions and interpretations. So I decided, let me just stick to facts. Talking about the facts, Professor Krishna is a trustee of KFI. He has been the rector of Rajghat Educational Center and principal of Rajghat Besant School from 1986 to 2002. Prior to that, for 24 years, he had been the professor of physics at the reputed, well-reputed Indian University, Banaras Hindu University. He has published more than 70 articles in national and international journals on spirituality, education, and science. He has written 3 books, out of which the last or the recent most caught my attention. The book is titled A Jewel on a Silver Platter. I turned to this book. It is about his memory of J. Krishnamurti, remembering J.T. Krishnamurti. That is the subtitle of the book. I found one particular chapter of the book. It is called The Art of Dialogue. Extremely important. In my understanding, this chapter has been translated into a few Indian languages, including Hindi and Odia. In Cuttack Center, we have translated this chapter, and the people who facilitate in any of the K dialogues, they are requested to read the article first before going into the dialogue. The participants of the dialogue are all given a copy so that they read and realize what a dialogue is. This particular chapter has been very, very helpful to me. And I would suggest that if you are actually going forward with any dialogue, either as a participant or as a facilitator, please read this chapter. Then there is another chapter in the book. It is titled, Is Krishnamurti's Teaching Practical? Is Krishnamurti's teaching practical? I find personally this chapter to be unique. Most of us at some point of our life, we question, what is this teaching to me? I have changed myself, modified myself to some extent. I have become different a little bit, but is the whole article about changing me partially? And when I read this article, I was quite surprised that very, very subtly, in a very sensitive tone, Professor Krishna has answered the question. I would say he has not answered the question, rather he has said that, is such a thing possible? This is a quote from that chapter I'm taking. Is such a thing possible? And that question stays in the mind without really looking for the answer, as if that itself is the answer. Then coming from the book to the person, Professor Krishna, I was thinking to myself, what made this man who had built up his career of 24 years in a very good university as a professor of physics, give up everything and come to the Krishnamurti circle? What was he trying to get? What did he try to accomplish? Did he have a goal? Did he have a motive? And that was my question. But perhaps none of this. He gave up his entire life of career, teaching, job, reputation. He came not alone, but with his wife, Meenakshi. I call her Meenakshi, his wife. Madam is not present today, but she was here with us yesterday. And What made both of them come to the Krishnamurti circle? To start a journey afresh from scratch, nothing. I would say, after reading his book, he came to Krishnamurti circle effortlessly, without looking for the future, never looking back into the past. He started everything on that moment, along with his wife and family, on that moment. And it was a new journey of which he didn't know anything. This thing actually started in the room of J. Krishnamurti when he was in Rajghat in November 1985. And there was a conversation between Krishnamurti and Professor Krishna and Meenakshi. And I was very much I was very much impressed by this conversation, what took place. I was scared of just reading aloud what happened between the three people there in the room. So I made a PowerPoint so that all of us could look at it. Krishnamurti said it was 1985 and he was about to leave the world and he wanted to set his house in order. And he said, before I go, I want you to take charge of this place. It is a sacred place. It was handed over to me by Mrs. Besant, and I want to hand it over to you. Will you take it? I want you to come and live here. Make this your home for life. You understand? I mean for life. It is being offered to you like a jewel on a silver platter. And I'm asking you, will you take it? He continued, wait, sir, let me ask your wife. And he takes her hand into his and looks at her intently. My dear darling, will you do this for me? Will you come and live here? Make this your home. I don't have a word to say about Professor Krishna after these words. He was asked by a person who has never asked anybody anything about his teaching. So, thank you very much, sir, for being with us today. Please. Sir, you are muted. Will you please unmute yourself?
Thank you, Nandini, for that kind introduction. You brought back to me, to my mind, the memories of that great man, whom I consider to be like Socrates of the 20th century. When such a person asks you to do something, you don't say no, because he sees very far, including what is good for you. And that was the feeling with which I accepted his offer, though I was quite diffident because I knew what he wanted done. And I told him that I don't think I can do that here. I'll be letting you down. And he said, sir, if we think that is the right thing to do, that's what we should be doing. Whether it succeeds or not is not our concern. Now that was straight from the Gita, which I remembered. And I said, yes, I agree that children should be brought up the way you have pointed out. I'm only saying I may not be able to make that happen here the way you want it. That's how it all began. But let me come to today's topic about exploring consciousness or conditioning. Now, we have heard Krishnamurti yesterday as well as today, what he says about conditioning. I'm not going to talk about what he says. He also said, don't accept what I say. You explore what I say. It points to the truth, but it is not the truth. You have to examine it in your own life and come upon your own perceptions to find out if that is the truth. It is that discovery of the truth which acts on consciousness, not the knowledge of what Krishnamurti said or anybody else said. No knowledge transforms consciousness. The truth which lies at the level of perception, not at the level of ideation and knowledge, can transform consciousness. That's how I understand his teaching. So he exhorts us not to accept what anybody says, not even Krishnamurti, much less me. There is a lot of confusion, I feel, in K circles about what he said about interpretation. He did say that he didn't want any interpreters for his teaching. I want to say to you that interpretation is unavoidable. Even when we read Krishnamurti's book, we read a sentence in that, our own mind interprets the meaning of that sentence, and our minds are conditioned. Therefore, interpretation is inevitable. But do I have to accept any interpretation? After all, an interpretation is like an opinion, and opinions are not truths. Truth lies at the level of perception. Being aware of that, can one not accept any interpretation, but listen to it and examine it in one's own daily life to discover for oneself if what it states is true or not true? That is what is called self-knowledge. It's quite different from knowledge as we learn in school, college, and university, which is essentially the cultivation of memory and skills, which does not transform consciousness. So this other inquiry, called self-knowledge, is to discern what is true and what is false. So I have done that with Krishnamurti's teaching to whatever extent I am able to. And what I am going to talk about is my exploration. You may not find those things which I say anywhere in Krishnamurti's teaching. So don't accept it as an authoritative statement about his teaching. It is just my exploration. Now, as he has mentioned, also in today's video, we are the product of the past. Millions of years of past has created humanity. There is the entire biological evolution. And scientists tell us that the brain has evolved and retained some of the essential elements of various brains during the biological evolution. So our brain contains the fish brain, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and then on top of it is the neocortex, which makes us human, because we have then the capacity to think, to have speech, and imagination, and intelligence. Intelligence of thought. All that we have got in the course of biological evolution. And when one is born, that conditioning, the biological conditioning, is already built into the brain. So all human beings experience fear. All human beings have the same instincts, sexuality. The body is more or less similar. And on top of it, then is the knowledge and the experience which gets stored in the course of education, as well as one's own life experience, as the outermost layer of conditioning. Now, this biological conditioning is a fact because the brain is a fact. You can't change it. But you can ask, what is our right relationship with it? That's the question one must ask in the course of self-knowledge, inquiry of self-knowledge for oneself. What is my relationship with this body? Is it my body? We all consider that it is my body. Do I own it? Which means, can I use it to further my own ambitions, to seek more and more pleasure for myself, and so on, which is what we do. But we need to question that. Are we owners of this body? You didn't buy it in the market. You don't own it like you own your furniture or your house. When you own something, there is an element of callousness in it, that I can use this for my own purpose in any way I like. And we say, mind your own business if somebody points out that you're misusing it. India does that when some other country points out that you're being cruel in Kashmir. They say it's our internal problem. You mind your own business. Don't talk about this. A man who beats up his wife, his neighbor comes and tells him, don't do that. He can say, it's my wife, you'll take care of your wife. So there is an element of callousness that enters in ownership. So I'm raising this question. Do we own our body? Or does it belong to nature? It has come to us through this long process of biological evolution. And there is a consciousness which is associated with the body. So is it the responsibility of the consciousness to look after the body, care for it, or is it the owner of this body? That's a question which one must, if one is serious, one has to ask, because that's also a conditioning. I noticed that Krishnamurti did not identify with his body. And that created the question in my mind, which I have transferred to you. The answer has no meaning, because you have to explore this question in your own life with a learning mind. And whatever perceptions you get would be what is your destiny. But it's an important question. Are my children in the sense I can use them to further my own interests? Or am I in charge of them? Needing to look after them, care for them, help them in their life, be a friend to them. The same with my wife, my family, and so on. It's important to ask these questions, because when you identify, you build your ego, and the ego enters into that relationship. When Krishnaji talked about himself, he often didn't use the word I. He would say K. He would refer to himself by an anonymous name, Krishnamurti, that boy, Krishnamurti. He didn't identify. So that may be the way we need to relate with the biological elements of physical pain and pleasure, of fear, the physical part, which is there for everybody. Even the sage, if he falls down and breaks his bones, will feel the biological pain. He may not have self-pity, which is psychological pain. So one has to distinguish between the physical and the psychological. It is the psychological which creates the problem. Let's look at sexuality, which has become such a big problem in the world. It's something that nature has given. It is there in plants, it is there in animals, it is there in human beings. But in human beings, it has become all this ugly thing like rape and pornography and so on. Neither animals nor plants suffer from any of this, because our mind creates lust, which is thinking about the sex and the pleasure of sex, and then demanding maximization of it and repetition of it, which is all the psychological part. So one has to inquire into this, because the sexual act is a natural act. It doesn't create any problems. But the lust creates a problem. So is it possible for the mind to relate in such a way as not to create lust, which is not to say not have sex. When sex is done without lust, it can be part of love. It can be part of care, affection. Two people willingly consenting and sharing a certain joy which is derived from it. But when you are selfishly demanding it only for yourself, it becomes an egoistic action and it becomes ugly. So that's why Krishna says, love is where the self is not. That means the ego is not. When the motive is not egoistic, it's part of love. So that's the way one has to ask questions about the biological. What is my relationship with the biological? You can't eliminate it. Then there is the cultural conditioning, which goes back a few thousand years, because it's also connected with religion and the way of life and the values that you inherit from the family in which you are born and you grow. That conditions the child, mind of the child. And we have all been children, so we carry it with us. They create division because in a different culture, the values are different. And people dislike each other or hate each other because their values are different. That creates division between cultures. It can be eliminated by travel, by observing with a learning mind, that your way of living is not the only way, that other people live differently. They are not necessarily evil. So you have to free your mind of this judgment, because the judgment from a conditioned mind creates division. But if you observe without judgment, you can learn. So that's the kind of learning that needs to be done. And one has to ask oneself also, what is true and what is false? Because in the cultural domain, there are a lot of notions that we have which are false. They are not factual. And if they create a lot of discrimination or violence and so on, then you need to question it. You need to question the assumptions on which it is based. Krishnaji has done that. He has questioned patriotism, nationalism, the notion that my country or my culture is the best culture in the world. You haven't even examined the other cultures. And it narrows the brain down, because then you only concentrate on your own culture. So to have a global mind means to regard all the wisdom of all the cultures, of all times, as your inheritance, because you are basically a human being, not an Indian or a Greek or an Italian or a British. But if you confine yourself to that and you say, I will learn only from the wisdom that was in my culture, you narrow it down. You don't have a global mind. So a lot of these cultural divisions come from such illusions, which are not facts. And therefore, if you engage in self-knowledge and discover that it is not a fact, you can drop it. For the Indian mind, casteism is such a thing. Somebody started, some human being has started casteism in society. And that has divided society, created discrimination, looking down on people and so on, just because of where they were born, which family and so on. So recently I read Gorky. He said, one is free only for the first 5 minutes of one's life, because you can cry or you can laugh and do what you like. After that, they impose a religion. Society imposes a religion, a caste, a nationality. And then the rest of your life, you spend stupidly defending all this identification. So you are no longer free. You are identified. So what creates division? Because division leads to war, to conflict in life. This is a question one has to examine in one's daily living, because one experiences this division, which arises from judgments and hatred and so on. Now let me pose the question in the following way. Everything is different from everything else. No two trees are alike, no two dogs are alike, no two leaves of the same tree are alike. So all human beings are also different from each other. Basically, we are similar. We stand on the same ground. We have the same instincts, the same capacities, and so on. But in their expression, we differ. Somebody is more intelligent in one direction, somebody in another direction. It's called the Swabhava. It's also genetic to some extent. Now, why do some differences create division and other differences don't create? We see, when we see them as differences, it doesn't divide. So you have not had a war between tall people and short people, though they are different, because they don't group together and seek security in that group. But if you identify with an ideology or with a belief or with a nationality, then you create division. Your mind is then caring only for what you identify with. It becomes like your personal lawyer defending the me and the mine and working for the progress of the me and the mine. And that's precisely what we call the ego. So the ego state is something that comes from that kind of approach. And when you discover that it's the most destructive thing, both in one's personal life and in society. Because Krishnaji pointed out that society is not different from us. So if we have division in our mind and our consciousness, then society has those divisions. So it's important to stay with this question and look at it in one's own daily life. That's another thing one learns from Krishnamurti, that you must not separate religion from daily life. Otherwise, it becomes an escape. You must always remain connected to everyday life, not get lost in some belief, some notions, some ideas, identify with them, and then defend them. That's what is an illusion. An illusion is something that is not a fact of nature, but it has become a fact for you because you have accepted a certain construct of the human mind. Nationalism, casteism, religious belief are all constructs like that. Neither the Hindu knows what Ishvara is, nor the Muslim knows what Allah is. But they have notions about it. And they are attached to their notions. And this attachment, identification with an illusion, divides us. And we have war among ourselves. So it's a psychological thing. And you can learn about it and free yourself of it. You can't free yourself of the biological because that's a fact. You can't change the fact. You can only ask what is the right place of it in my life? How should I relate with it? But a lot of this psychological is just my own construct or construct done by somebody else, which I have accepted. And that is why Krishnaji says, don't accept what I say, investigate. Find out if it is true. If you discover that it is true, then it has meaning. If you discover that it is false, discard it, throw it out. Then there are other deeper conditionings, the so-called psychological complexes with which psychologists and so on deal. They come from memories of pleasure and pain, psychological pleasure and psychological pain, which you hold on in memory. From childhood, you may have been terrorized, you may have been threatened, ill-treated. Those memories crop up later on and a kind of fear develops. Those are deeper. They can also be examined and one can free oneself of them. Then at the still deeper level is this conditioning of feeling that I am a separate self. Now you are not the tree. You are one object in nature, the tree is another object in nature. So one is not talking of becoming the tree. You have to be careful. But that doesn't create division. When you see a difference as only a difference, it doesn't create division. But when you attribute superiority or inferiority in that difference, then it creates division. So if you see that the man from Africa is dark and the man from Europe is pink, you're just seeing a fact. But when you say the whites are superior to the blacks, you have become a racist. You have created division. And therefore, one has to examine, why does the mind all the time judge and condemn as superior and inferior? That's the tendency at the root of all division. If I just see that the Muslim prays in a certain way in the mosque without a statue and so on, because that's how he has been taught to pray to some entity called Allah, which he also just believes in. And the Hindu does the same thing, but in front of a statue and in a different way with flowers and singing and so on in the temple, because that's what he has been trained to do. Then it doesn't divide. You say he's doing what like he eats the food which he likes and I eat the food which I like. We don't divide on that basis. So not all conditioning is evil. Only that conditioning which produces division, which produces disorder in consciousness and therefore in society, one needs to be observed and free oneself of. There's a lot of factual conditioning which you can relate to and live with. which is all useful also. So not to make conditioning into a dirty word as something evil to be done away with. Otherwise, you'll stop eating the food which you eat. That would be silly, or listening to the music which you like to listen. That doesn't create any disorder or division. Similarly, this thing of being free from the past doesn't mean that you don't cherish memories from the past. There is that famous poem of Wordsworth, which we have all read in school, where he says, where he sees daffodils along the bank of a lake. And he says, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the shore to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. He's remembering that past joy that he experienced, recalling it in memory, and feeling that joy again. What is wrong with it? If he uses that as to escape from boredom, then it becomes problematic. But otherwise, you have nostalgia about the home you lived in, and so on. So there's a lot of innocent conditioning, is what I am trying to say. And this is my exploration. This is not what Krishnamurti has said. You need to distinguish the two and have your own exploration. When you're clear in your mind that it produces no division, no discrimination, no violence, it's innocent conditioning. So don't just discard conditioning. That's a word, covers a whole lot of range of things, many of which are quite factual and innocent. Similarly with imagination. I mean, you need imagination to do surgery, to plan your travel, everything. But you can also create illusions out of imagination. And if those illusions are taken to be true, and you identify with them, derive importance for yourself, a status out of it, then it becomes a problem. It creates division. So those kind of illusions one has to rid one's mind of. But when you know that something is an illusion, not a fact, then it ceases to be an illusion. Like fairy tales are not illusions. You know that they are not true. It's when you take them to be true, when it is not really true, then it becomes an illusion. And that's what the Buddha pointed out long ago, 2,500 years ago, that ignorance is the cause of sorrow. Sorrow meaning all this psychological suffering. And ignorance not as lack of knowledge, but as illusion. Illusions create that. Krishnaji says the same. He says, disorder has a cause. Disorder in consciousness in the form of negative emotions has a cause, and therefore it can be eliminated. Because the cause, when you examine it, lies in illusion, some assumption which you are making, which is not true. You can find that out through self-knowledge and end it. Therefore, that sorrow or that can be ended. But the physical pain cannot be ended because that's not created by your thinking or your approach. So self-knowledge is to learn what is the right place of everything in life. Right place of thought, right place of imagination, right place of sex, right place of food, everything. And that's the art of living. Krishnaji talked about the art of living. So he has not said, discard this, keep that. In fact, he said those ideas, if you try to practice, you can't practice virtue. And virtue is order in consciousness. And you can come upon order in consciousness by eliminating the disorder, because the disorder arises from illusion. And illusion can be got rid of by discerning what is true and what is false. Such a learning mind, observing mind, is the true religious mind. That's the teaching. So he said, churches and mosques and temples are not religious places because there is no learning taking place there. This kind of learning, self-knowledge learning. But a school can be a religious place if it promotes this kind of learning. So the religious mind is a learning mind. And in order to learn, not just intellectually, which we do in school and college and so on, but actually, perceptually, through observation in your own life. So you stay with the question, you explore the question, but you explore with all your senses. That's important. And you discover the truth, then you are willing to drop the illusion. But if you are attached to the illusion, you won't drop it. Then it conditions you, and that conditioning colors all your perception. And therefore, you cannot come upon the truth. That was the question I posed to Krishnaji, which constitutes the dialogue in chapter 3 of my book. It began with saying, sir, the man who is caught in the ego field that cannot perceive the truth because his ego colors the perception. And because it colors the perception, the ego continues. So he can't see the truth, therefore the ego continues. So where does this circle end, vicious circle end? And he went into it in great detail. I don't have the time to go into it here, but you can read that. Very important dialogue, which was taped. David Bohm was part of it. Asit Chanmal was part of it. And we went into this question nearly 1.5 hours. He went into this question. So all this inquiry is for understanding oneself and one's relationship in life, and for ending the disorder in consciousness and therefore in one's own life. So I'll end it here. That's how I feel that one needs to relate to one's conditioning, not feel depressed or look down on conditioning, but just examine it. It is something that exists in your brain, and the false part of it can be dropped. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krishna, for this insightful talk. I would say that always I find your talk like a wake-up call, and always I find your talk like tying up the loose ends of our understanding. So beautifully, I mean to say, you express, you present the things that it helps us to tie up the loose ends of our understanding. So again,
so, Mitra,
thanks. So,
you are a friend. Don't praise me. I'm trying to drop the ego, and you're trying to build it.
So, but sir, that is what is no. I'm saying the fact only. So, thank you, sir. So now we can open up the question answer session.
Yes.
Yeah. So first, Dave.
Thank you. I'm a little reluctant. Yeah.
I'm a little reluctant to ask this question because it's not directly related to what has been said in the talk today. So if it's considered inappropriate, let's just drop it. But
no question is inappropriate, Claire.
no, it does refer to something you said, Professor Krishna. I probably in your last book, but anyway, something I associate with you. I think you said that Krishnamurti's work, his talks, are not concerned with content. They are entirely concerned with approach. And I was interested yesterday to hear Mark Lee make a very, very similar comment to that. And I wondered if you could enlarge a little on that, if you find it appropriate. If
Yes.
I've got the words right, I may have not.
Yes, I think that's a question worth investigating. Krishnaji did say that the approach to a question is more important than the question or the answer, because it determines what you will receive from the question. Let me take an example to illustrate that. I have been a teacher, and a teacher takes a lot of pains to prepare his lectures and so on and communicate the knowledge to the class which he is taking. Suppose a student goes out and speaks to a friend and says, Professor Krishna is a lousy teacher. I don't really understand what he is teaching. And the other student communicates this to me. I can feel insulted. I can feel angry. If I have a reactive mind, I feel upset that I work so hard for these people. He doesn't pay attention in the class and he goes out and badmouths me. Let him come. I'll see how he does that and so on. So you shout at him or you get angry or do whatever you like to create a fear so that he doesn't speak again about you like that because you're worried about your reputation or your. Suppose I don't approach the event in that way. Suppose I listen to what he says without reacting. I take it as an input of information that there is a student in my class who is not understanding what I say. And after all, as a teacher, it's my responsibility to convey the subject matter to the student. So I need to know his level of understanding and speak at that level. So next day I go into the class and I try to find out if there are more students like that. Am I assuming a certain amount of knowledge which they don't possess? And maybe I find that, yes, there are more students like that. And so I can modify my teaching. I can make it more elementary so that they begin to understand and so on. So I take that as a constructive input, not as an insult, but as a criticism that needs to be looked at. See, the approach has made all the difference. If you have not reacting, which is an ego process, but you're observing and learning and taking it as a question, the observation, then you can learn from it, learn from criticism. But if you are reacting, you don't listen. You just get angry. So the approach to the event makes all the difference. I mean, that's just one example to illustrate how the approach colors your perception. So the learning mind is not a reacting mind. It's an observing mind inquiring mind. And it has humility, because without humility, you will react.
Thank you, Professor Krishna and Clive. Dave? Yeah, please.
Professor Krishna, your talks are always inspiring. And this talk of yours made me ask this question.
Sure.
What is the place of inspiration in self-knowledge? Understanding the fact that interpretation could be a product of thought. I'll just repeat it. What place has interpretation have in self-knowledge? Understanding the fact that interpretation could be a product of thought.
See, if you are deeply interested in something, you pay attention to it. It doesn't need inspiration. You need inspiration when the mind is dull, when it is not interested in what is being done, and it needs some kind of praise or reward or encouragement to make it pay attention. So I think if one is sensitive and one really loves what one is doing, then there is automatically a passion in it. But if that passion has to be activated by somebody else, then you are depending on that somebody else for inspiration. And that is the problem with gurus and so on. They do inspire, but you depend on inspiration from the guru. So the dependence on the guru becomes the factor that binds you. So can one do this because one has deep interest in this learning about oneself? Not as an achievement, but when you are really interested in something, you pay attention to it, not in order to get something else. Unfortunately, we have all been motivated by reward and punishment through school and college, and that is a very major conditioning that one gets into. So that unless there is a reward in what I'm trying to do, I'm not interested. The reward can be physical, material, or it can be psychological. Some praise, some fame, some good opinion of somebody else, etc. So one has to learn this. One has to learn to free oneself of this. And one has also to see why the mind has become insensitive. Insensitivity can be caused by several factors, and you need to eliminate those factors if there is insensitivity. It can be because your body has become lazy, because you're not eating the right food or taking exercise, or you're too ambitious so that you're all the time thinking only about your work in the office and you're not paying attention to other things. All that leads to insensitivity. So if you want to be sensitive, you have to eliminate the causes of insensitivity in your life, which is the learning, which is self-knowledge. But why do you need somebody else to motivate you towards self-knowledge? That itself becomes a question to be investigated. Because if you need somebody else to motivate you, then you become dependent on that.
Sorry, Professor. My question was slightly different. My question was, what place has interpretation in self-knowledge?
Oh, I thought you said inspiration.
Sorry, it was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Interpretation. Yeah, I said that interpretation is inevitable because when you read a sentence, your mind interprets the meaning of that sentence. Not only when another person says something about it, but your own mind says something about it. Also, it is interpretation. So long as one knows that interpretation is only an opinion, it's not a truth, why would one accept it? If you are interested in coming upon the truth, you look upon all interpretation, whether that of your friend or another person or your own mind also, so that there is this element of doubt that this is what I think, but is that true? And don't answer that question from your memory, from your knowledge, because the memory contains all the illusions, all the conditioning. So don't answer it from your conditioning. Watch it in your daily life through awareness. Awareness is not a thought phenomenon, and therefore it is free from coloration. The interpretation of what you are aware is colored by conditioning, but awareness itself is not conditioned. You have to be very subtle about this. It can be very confusing because we are trained into concluding, and we take the conclusion as the answer, and that becomes your conditioning before you come upon the truth, and it blocks. The moment you accept an answer, it blocks the inquiry, finishes the inquiry before you have got to the perception of the truth. So you have to be careful. There is a metaphor which explains this, which is beautiful, so I'll share it with you. It says that reason and logic are like the poles of a pole vaulter. He can use it to raise himself up, but if he doesn't leave it, it doesn't get to the other side. It's like that. So
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thought has the role of creating the question and of communicating the question. After all, I have communicated today a number of questions, and I've been thinking about it. So don't discard thought. There is no thought is not a mischief maker. But the right use of thought is in communication. It cannot bring you to perception because it's a fragmentary, partial thing in our consciousness.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dev. Now, before going to Mr. Murthy, there is a question in the chat box before Murthy raised his hand. So we will take up the question. Ravi Shankar, are you there? Would you like to read out your question, Ravi Shankar? Okay, let me read it out. This is question is: are these different approaches a result of one's own conditioning? Again, I repeat: are these different approaches a result of one's own conditioning?
If you are doing it because you have read that and somebody has said you should do this, then it can be part of your conditioning. But if you have discovered for yourself the value of this kind of approach, and you have seen the danger of the reactive approach, because that's an egoistic approach, then if you are interested in the truth, why would you use that approach? But we use the reactive approach because we are more concerned with the result and with intimidating the other person so that it doesn't behave in that way. So it's somewhere seeking security for oneself. You have to be free of all that tendency. Then only you have a learning mind.
Okay. Now, please, Mr. Murthy, please go ahead with your question.
Good morning to all. Sir, my question is like this. In the famous speech of 1929, when Krishnaji dissolved the order of the star, he made a famous statement that the truth is a pathless land, and his desire is to make man absolutely and unconditionally free. From this, my question is, freedom from something looks like a relative freedom. And is there something called absolute freedom? That is freedom per se. And also, in one of his talks, Krishnaji talks of freedom being love. What does it mean?
Sir, when you start with this inquiry, whenever you start with any inquiry, the simpler questions will be tackled first. And the more profound questions will come up later. So when you begin this learning or exploring your own conditioning, you have to begin with where you are. If you are angry, if you feel jealous, if you feel rivalry and competition, those are the questions you need to tackle. Not the question of what happens after death or what is God and things like that, which are very far. I mean, if you haven't even solved these questions, your mind is colored so much that it will not be able to handle a more profound question. If I may give a metaphor, you are asking for attacking the Pythagoras theorem before doing the elementary first few theorems. You will never be able to solve it. So here, it's not that there is a sequence of illusions, but when you start looking at illusions, the simpler ones like casteism, religious thing, and so on, will go first. Then you will come to this question of ego, freedom from the ego, which is freedom from all identification with everything, with the body and so on. You may never come upon that. You may never come to freedom from that. So don't make this total freedom into a problem to be achieved. Otherwise, it becomes a desire process and sustains the ego. Just begin from where you are and start learning. The change from a reactive mind to a learning mind doesn't take time. It's just a question of changing direction. You're no longer wanting to achieve something. You're wanting to learn about something. The desire to learn something doesn't create ego, but the desire to become something, achieve something, creates the ego, sustains the ego. So there is a subtle difference. And when one learns, one doesn't make the mistake of stepping into the ego realm. The two are it's a very subtle inquiry. You know, sir, love will look just like attachment. In attachment also, you care for the one you are attached to. In love also, you care about the person you love. Attachment looks like love, but one is egoistic, the other is without an ego. So it is very subtle And you will have to watch quite a lot to have that clarity. It's not as if you are gradually becoming free. You become free when you have that perception. The perception is not gradual, but there is not one illusion in the mind. There are hundreds of illusions. Each illusion requires a perception. And you don't get rid of 20% of the illusion and then 50% and then go up to the 100%. It's not like that. It's like it's like pregnancy. Either a woman is pregnant or she is not pregnant. It can't be 50% pregnant. So
Thank
either
you.
you have perceived the truth or you have not perceived the truth. There is not a gradual perception.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Before going to Mr. Jagan Seshadri, there are a few more questions in the chat box, but let us take it.
Sure.
We missed Mr. Ramakrishna had raised his hand in the chat box. He wants to ask the question directly. Mr. Ramakrishna. You are muted, sir. Please unmute yourself.
Samitra, you can read the question, it will save time.
He has not put the question. He just wrote that he wants to ask directly.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Namaste, Professor Krishnaji.
Namaste.
My question is, I remember that Krishnaji has said that you can never finish the understanding of yourself or consciousness bit by bit, like anger, jealousy, greed, etc. But you have to understand yourself as a whole. Then, what is that seeing involved in that? And how can we be aware of the whole at a glance? Please give me understanding about it.
Yes, first of all, to approach something with all your senses, not just with the intellect. Otherwise, you are approaching not holistically, so your answer will not be holistic. He has himself pointed this out. We have been taught to specialize. When you specialize, you pay attention only to one thing which you are learning. And he's talking about looking at the whole of life through awareness. We are using thought. Thought is fragmentary. See, sir, when you look at a tree, you see the whole tree, the beauty of the tree and so on. You are aware of the tree. But when you have to describe the tree, thought will describe the stem, then the height, then the width, then the leaves, then the branches, and so on. So thought has this quality that it will always fragment the thing bit by bit, and then give you a picture where you will have to put all these bits together to see the whole. Whereas awareness sees the whole. So not to use thought. We have been trained into using thought, analysis, and so on. And he's saying, don't use thought. Thought is a conditioned instrument. Use awareness, which is a faculty which we have not used enough. We are all the time using thought, and therefore it is fragmentary. So that's why he talked about choiceless awareness. The choice comes from, I like this, I don't like this, I want this, I don't want this, and so on. So it comes from judgment and all that, which is all a thought process and conditioning process. So to be free from all that is the first requirement. I will direct you to the book called Wholeness of Life, where there are dialogues which Krishnamurti has with David Bohm and some other people. I think in dialogue 3 or 4, he points out that all this freedom from the ego and so on is all very elementary. Until that is attained, the learning does not even begin, because the ego colors the perception. So you don't see the truth. Then he says, when you have understood thought and put it in its right place, the mind becomes silent. Thought becomes silent. And then in that space, the subconscious enters. It can also be watched, and you can free yourself of the subconscious. When that is done, then the collective subconscious appears in consciousness. That can also be watched, and you have to go beyond that. So there are many, many depths to this, and that's why it is endless. He said so himself, that it is endless. We are all talking about the first step, which is freedom from the ego.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. The next question is in the chat box from Rajendra Sharma. His question is, how do we define the false without knowing what is true? What is the structure of false?
You have to watch your consciousness, and the false, if it produces disorder in consciousness, it's very detectable, because that disorder is either conflict or pain or insult and so on. So it's very perceptible. So the way to do this learning is every time you experience disorder in consciousness, which means any negative emotion, jealousy or anger, don't suppress it. Don't run away from it. Watch it. It is something that has arisen within your consciousness, and it has a causation. Watch the whole thing. How does it begin? How does it build up? And how does it decay? Just watch. Don't interfere. Don't suppress. Don't judge. Don't condemn. Don't do a thing. Because you are the problem. The problem is not life. You are the problem. You are creating the problem. So keep yourself out of it, which means the observer goes out. Only observation is taking place. All this opinion, it will come in. But when you discover the problem with it, when you discover that it complicates the thing, it will cease. You have to discover the danger of the ego, of the self. Then why would you approach something? You don't approach danger. Where there is danger, you don't go into that. So you get tempted because it is not clear. The danger is not clear to you. If you watch attentively, you'll discover the danger of the ego. Then you won't approach it egoistically. Everything can be done egoistically, and the same thing can be done non-egoistically. A game can be played egoistically, and the same game can be played non-egoistically. So it's just the approach. And when it is egoistic, it will have all the disorder, the complications, everything will arise. When it is not egoistic, it's part of love.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we are running short of time. So we'll take up one more question from Jagan Seshadri, who has raised his hand for a long time. And all other questions in the chat box, even Mr. Ravi has also has put a question in the chat box. With the permission of Mr. Professor Krishna, we will forward him all the questions, and we would request him to send the, address all those questions. So if you have any other question also, you can put it in the chat box, or you can also mail us. So, and we will forward all those questions to Professor Krishna. Yes, Jagan, please. This will be the
Let
last
me
question.
get that clear,
Jagan.
Soumitra. So you are going to send me the questions which have not been addressed in an email,
Right, sir. Right, sir.
And I'll reply to you in an email.
Right, sir.
Yeah.
Then we will circulate it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Mr. Jagan, are you there?
Good morning, Professor Krishna.
Good morning.
I just want to also pleasantly share that we have met in 2008, and it is such a joy to see you again, sir. Thank you so much. I want to thank the Katak the organizing committee for this opportunity to meet you after such a long time, sir. So not taking much time of everybody, I just have this one question which has been there. Sir, I have been very sincerely reading and reflecting upon Krishnaji's work, especially when it comes to his pointers towards education, and it also has pointers on responsibility about parenting. And particularly for me, I have found them to be very practical, very useful. And after I have been reading and reflecting upon them, I have got this deep urge to wanting to share it with young parents, for the simple reason I believe if that can be shared and more people can understand, a lot of good thing can happen in terms of children being understood better, and education also understood. So I want to know how should I look at this urge of mine of wanting to share this thing? Is it a passing thing, or but it is sincere, sir? I want to say it is sincere. I want to systematically approach and share this. I want you to please let me know your thoughts on why I feel this way, or should I just ignore this urge of mine?
No, why should you ignore it? I would suggest that you go to your neighborhood school, talk to the principal, and see if you can convince him that you can be useful by talking to the parents, because this is a problem which all schools face, that they may talk or say anything in the classroom, but the child is also in his family. And so the parents are the first teachers, and the child is governed by the parents to a large extent. So it is more important for the parent to understand all this than even the teacher. So yes, if you can convince him, then he might give you an opportunity, call the parents and you can talk to them. But it is not something that can be done in one talk. So you will have to work out how to interact with them, because they will have a lot of questions and so on. It needs a lot of self-knowledge, which they don't have. So you have to be prepared to give a lot of time for this. And the principal there has to be convinced that you are the right person to do it, and he wants it. Otherwise, find another school to do it. That would be the way to go about it. I wouldn't say you should destroy the urge, because it's a very useful, it's a great need in society today, because children are suffering. Parents don't know how to handle children. And it's a fault of our education that every child is going to become a parent, but our education never teaches us how children should be raised. Yeah.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. I'm so touched and feeling very happy to have heard this from you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Nandini, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I was
To end
just
the
saying,
session?
before we go for a break, I just wanted to say that what took place 36 years ago is still alive, and it is shared with each one of us. And it is our responsibility, not only Professor Krishna's, it is each of us who have the responsibility of keeping the jewel clean and sacred. Thank you very much, Professor Krishna, and thank you everyone who asked questions and listened quietly.